Hello and welcome to today's Insight webinar. We're thrilled to have you join us here today. This should be a very interesting one. Today we are looking at how to succeed with a minimalist approach to digital transformation. Kind of a different approach to what we normally talk about. I'm eager to dive into this. First, we'd like to thank our Insight webinar series sponsors. The gold sponsor today, our presenter today is Mark with L2L. Our platinum sponsor, Inductive Automation. Then we have Hilscher Software AG, Uptake, and Sesame. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to all of you joining us today. The webinar has started. I want to make sure you can hear me. My name is Chris McNamara. I am Editor-in-Chief with Smartindustry. If you can't hear me, if you're having trouble, you can check to make sure your computer mute button is turned to off. You can log off and log back in. And if you still can't hear me, you can contact tech support by typing your message in the questions and answers box on your screen. We'd love to make today an active dialogue with Mark. So please do submit your questions. Use that question mark button on your screen there. That'll send questions into us that we can pose to Mark during the presentation today. If it's on topic or if it's more kind of an evergreen question, we'll get an answer for you at the Q&A section on the back end. If you are joining us on demand today, thank you for joining us. You can still submit questions in that same method, and we'll get an answer for you via email. Lastly, do check out the handout section on your screen there. You'll find today's presentation slides and some other content from L2L that will supplement what we're learning today. So what are we learning today? We are talking about success with a minimalist approach to digital transformation. You know, oftentimes we talk about trying to resolve the complexity of digital transformation and people concerned about not understanding all the different components and the different approaches and how to start, where to start and what tools to use and all that stuff. And this is kind of a nice fresh approach in terms of simplifying that process, which I think is very appealing to a lot of people. Let's talk about who we're talking to today. We got Mark Hungerford. Mark is VP of Global Customer Support with L2L. Mark has 10 years of experience with a global consumer electronics manufacturer with a focus on lean and TPM transformations. His background in maintenance and operations leadership allows Mark to become an extension of L2L's customer continuous improvements and productions team. He's a product of North Carolina State University's Maintenance Reliability Program and is a BA in Business Administration from the University of Northwestern Ohio. Without further ado, Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we got a lot to get to, and I hope we have a lot of questions to field during the presentation. So let's jump right into the presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. So jumping right into things, you know, if you look at this day and age, it's amazing how much is at our fingertips. There's so much available via our cell phones and computers and in the internet. And when you really think about how easy it is to get data, you know, sometimes you wonder, do we really need it all, right? And certainly there's a lot of, you know, iPhone apps or just apps in general that maybe don't provide that much value. So when we look at this topic, it's really focused around when we look at minimalist approach to digital transformation as it relates to manufacturing, how do we identify what's really necessary and maybe what's not so necessary? And part of that today, we're going to walk you through, you know, how do you take that first step and really identify, you know, what questions should we be asking? How do we identify some of our biggest challenges and opportunities before, you know, moving forward with digital transformation? Then also, you know, how do we develop a strategy, you know, and what's critical in developing that strategy? We're going to talk a little bit about behaviors and how do we take action in relation to those transformation strategies. Ultimately then, some key elements of building a long-term digital transformation plan that really everybody can buy into from the top down and really help drive your digitization efforts to ultimately provide the most value and ROI to the business. So a lot to cover today. I'm excited to be here with you, and let's jump right into things.
Sounds good.
So one of the first things that we work with our customers on is asking some questions. And you might be thinking, you know, what questions should I be asking, you know, as I embark on this digital transformation journey? And one of the big ones is the why. You know, why is it that you're deciding to transform, or maybe you have done some digital transformation and you're looking to take the next step. Maybe you're on an Industry 4.0 journey, right? And you recognize that digitization is a big part of that. But it's really important, and we'll get into this a little deeper as we move through the presentation, but understanding the why that we're focused on digital transformation. Some companies are looking for like a competitive edge, or they've got some challenges with maybe the business is growing, or they have some efficiency struggles. Maybe they're measuring OEE or looking to measure OEE, and they know they just don't have the data to be able to give them that information. Maybe there's a burning platform that's driving digitization. A lot of people this past year, I think, was a really challenging and unique year for manufacturing in general. I would say that's probably one of the biggest burning platforms that we've seen to drive digitization is certainly the pandemic around the coronavirus. Companies that had taken that first step and had focused on digitization, from our experience, were a step up or a step ahead of those who had kind of waited or gotten caught up in some of the pitfalls of traditional digitization efforts. And maybe, it's one of those things you just know it's the right thing to do. Everybody else is doing it, and you're moving in that direction. So it is really important to understand why. And there's an Elon Musk quote, that says people work better when they know what is the goal and why. And it's the same with digital transformation. It's really important to understand, why are we doing this, and why are we embarking on this journey? The next key question is identifying what. So when we look at a digital transformation journey, we want to understand, what does that mean for our company or for our manufacturing facility? And when we look at that, there's a couple of things that are important to gather when you're trying to capture the what, and that's your current state. Depending on where you're at in the journey will depend on what the next step is from a digitization standpoint, and calibrating on what do you have for digitized systems today. Sometimes people don't realize how much they do have digitized, and then they certainly oftentimes recognize opportunities. But you may have things like your time clocks. I think the majority of companies now, they have, badge swipes, and that manages time. You may also have some digitization around your ERP and maybe production entries. You may even have, a CMMS or something like that where you're capturing some digital downtime. But really understanding what do you have today and baselining, what's there for data, and understanding also how are you using that data today from a digital perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about behaviors, and understanding and grasping your behaviors as it relates to data now is really important as you're embarking on those, adding more digitization to your facilities. The third key step is really it is important to have that vision for the future, and that North Star that you're headed towards. So you have to be careful with it. That can be a double-edged sword, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we talk about scaling. But it is critical to have that vision and identify where you'd like to be long term. So before we jump into the next section, I do want to talk about. You may be thinking like, hey, we're starting out, at a real basic level of systems, and what I mean by that is we work with a lot of companies that have varying degrees of equipment, digitization, integration, connectivity. Some customers have old equipment that doesn't even have a PLC, that's not networked, or you're still capturing a lot of information on paper. You're not alone. A lot of companies are in that same boat. They just haven't been able to make those digitization gains. 80% of our customers have little to no integration when we start working with them. Most companies are still using a lot of paper. They're still capturing things like, paper hour-by-hour boards, or maybe on whiteboards. And there's a lot of paper in terms of specifications, maybe around product deviation forms. all of those types of processes, in many facilities are still very paper-based. And they know they need to evolve, but they don't know where to start in a lot of cases, or they become overwhelmed with it in general. So before we jump to the next section, we're going to talk about how less is more. And we're going to compare a traditional approach to a minimalist approach to digital transformation and some of the pitfalls to watch out for in this journey. So let's start with the traditional approach. And you have to be really careful with this approach because a lot of times there's a bias to digitizing and integrating everything. And there's also this concept of let's put together a perfect plan before we do anything. We want to make sure we've got all of our ducks in a row and we have a perfect plan laid out before we take that first step. Typically, this approach can be overwhelming and take a really long time to implement, and it can also be very, very costly. Those that do embark on taking this traditional approach will oftentimes start with like a pilot line in a facility and become so overwhelmed with the pilot itself and implementing it and the cost and time and burden and the lack of the ability to really leverage that line that they never end up actually proliferating that to the rest of the facility, let alone the rest of the organization. It just becomes such a huge project and huge elephant they kind of burn out, so to speak. Part of the reason for that is because it typically is very machine focused. There's certainly tons of amazing technology around digitizing your process. And when I say process, in this sense, I'm talking about where we're transforming the products, the actual machines, lines that are converting your raw materials to finished goods. And so a lot of the traditional approach is laser focused around digitizing the machines. And that is an important aspect, but there is more to digitization than just machines. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So when you look at this traditional approach, in many cases, it's a solution looking for a problem. And we have to be really careful with this, which is going to be a different paradigm from more of a minimalist approach. So if we look at it,
Mark, let me jump in and ask you a question.
Sure, go ahead.
These are common problems that we see all the time with people who struggle with their digital transformations. But I love that concept of a traditional approach. What are we talking about? Because oftentimes the timeline is so short. What does traditional mean? Are we talking about people attempting these methods in the past 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 1 year? What time frame are we talking about?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly the last 10 years, and it's continuing to grow rapidly, I think, over the last 5 years. So digitization in Industry 4.0 is certainly taking off. So it's definitely, we're seeing it much more prevalent in the last 10 years.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep. So looking at the other side of the coin on a minimalist approach, let's talk about what makes this a unique approach. So when we talk about minimalist approach, it's really focusing on digitizing only what's necessary. And that's where it's important that we ask that why and what at the beginning, so that we can really get to what is necessary. It also relies on a bias for behavior and action. And when we look at this, behavior and action are key elements to success in a digitization journey. And the second piece of that is that it's an evolution over time. It's really focusing on a continuous improvement of digitization as it relates to your manufacturing facilities. And a good example of this is if you look at, I'm speaking into my smartphone here today. The smartphone is an excellent example of digitization over time and an evolution of digitization. I can remember probably 15 years ago, getting my first cell phone, and it made calls, and I could communicate, anywhere in the country, assuming I had a signal. Of course, that was always a challenge back then. It's gotten a lot better. But over time, the digitization of process has evolved. We came, I remember when text messages came out, that was a big thing. And then you could send images, and it's continued to evolve to the point now where there's lots of solutions that the smartphone has provided through digitization. You can actually just, order anything you need online and have the visibility to see exactly what's happening. But that didn't happen overnight. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's been an evolution and a continuous improvement over time. The difference is that from a minimalist approach, it's implementing solutions for real problems, as opposed to implementing solutions and then trying to find problems. Okay, so it's identifying what your problems are and then implementing solutions for those problems specifically. So there's definitely a distinction here on that more traditional approach versus the minimalist approach moving forward. So jumping into the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about how do we simplify your strategies. Okay, so if we want to put together a strategy for digitization, utilizing a minimalist approach, let's talk about, what behaviors are necessary. How do we drive action, and then what are some key insights as we embark on that journey? So this is something I learned. I started my career with Energizer, spent 10 years with the company, learned a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of things that have always stuck with me from Energizer, and this is one of them. This relates to behavioral change, and it's HV has got to be greater than R2 delta, or sometimes it's R2C. I can't take credit from this. I actually spoke to some previous colleagues to try to find out, hey, where did this come from? Because it's always resonated with me, and I wasn't able to figure out who originated it. So if anybody knows, feel free to throw it out in the chat so I can give credit to where credit's due. But it's something that's always stuck with me in terms of behavioral change. And if you've seen this before, what it deals with is HV has got to be greater than R2 delta or R2C. And that's that our hate for the current state, and I know that's a strong word, but our hate for just the way we're doing it today. We're doing it on paper, or you're using overhead paging systems, or when somebody walks by, you drag them over your line to have them help you with quality or maintenance or whatever. You really have to have a dissatisfaction as strong as hate in this instance, just hating the way it is today in your facility. You also have to have that vision, as we touched on in the first couple slides, or that vision for the future and how things could be. And a vision for how we can get to there has got to be greater than the resistance to change. And I spent 10 years working in facilities, and there is a tremendous amount of resistance to change. It's very easy to find all the reasons why not to evolve on a digital transformation or evolve on lots of different things in manufacturing. There's always going to be fires that you have, firefighting, whether they're quality issues or you have material issues or you have supplier issues. There's all these things that can ultimately consume your time that become these huge burdens that creates the resistance to change, and oftentimes will trip people up as they're trying to move forward on a digital innovation journey. So HV is greater than R2 delta. So it's your hate for the current state, your vision for the future has got to be greater than the resistance to change in order to move forward on a digitization journey.
Mark, let me pose you a question. In this realm,
Sure.
in the digitalization realm, is that resistance getting better as Industry 4.0 concepts and digitalization approaches become more mainstream, and as workforces become, not younger, but as younger workforces are more inclined to be digitally, they're digital natives, do you find that resistance to this stuff is lessening?
I would say yes, Chris. It's definitely lessening. In terms of the adoption and people's willingness to adopt these, I find more often than not, people are actually engaging in more digitization outside of the workplace than they are actually inside of the workplace. Oftentimes they go to work and they're doing things, with more traditional paper-based or old school legacy type systems, and then they go home and they use very advanced digitization apps and lots of other things. So I think the people are actually moving faster than the organizations are in terms of their willingness to adopt and adapt to that. The resistance to change and implementing it is certainly getting easier. the technology is advancing rapidly and it's becoming cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah.
But I would say the resistance in chaos, in the challenges in the plants is still very prevalent in terms of, limited resources and all the other competing priorities still is a huge burden for many manufacturers, and they have a hard time overcoming that resistance more so than the technology and or the adoption, at the shop floor level.
Change is hard. Excellent. Thanks.
Sure. So talking about behavioral change, if we expand on that, there's three keys to remember when it comes to digitalization, and that in order for change and improvement to be realized, the behavior must change. We have to change the way we think about the problems in the facility and the way we think about, how we want to digitize the facility. The biggest one alone that I find is that the belief that digitization and providing more data is going to inherently solve more problems and is going to be a type of silver bullet for an organization. And unfortunately, that's not true. I think we'd all wish that, it would do that, but data alone doesn't solve problems. There's still a huge human element and behavior around analyzing the data, understanding what data is necessary, and digitizing where it makes sense in your facility, and using people to help create those strategies to do that. So data alone doesn't solve problems. People still solve problems, and that's just the way it is, at this point in time. And then focusing on change for improvement, not change for the sake of change. And that really helps to align and make sure you're focused on things that you can control, things that you can measure, and things that you can drive improvement from. So this is a case study, actually, of one of our clients. They've been using the product for about 3 years. They were in, I would say, the same boat as a lot of plants that I visited and we've worked with, in that they knew they had older equipment with varying degrees of technology. Some machines didn't even have PLCs or HMIs. They had very little connectivity, but they knew they needed to get to a better place. They had a burning platform, and they knew they needed to increase increase the efficiencies of the plant. And they were going to do that by focusing on OEE. The problem was they didn't measure OEE, and they knew they needed better data to measure OEE. This company said, we need to do something now. And they actually implemented a 2-sensor approach. And this is actually getting easier and easier every year. Based on the question you brought up, Chris, in terms of the technology, it's never been as easy as it is today to add a sensor to a line. But we need to add those sensors so that we can capture things that are meaningful. This particular site actually put a sensor at the beginning of the line and a sensor at the end of the line. And they weren't even actually connected to the machines. But they figured out that if we had a sensor that we could tell when the product's coming into the line, and then we can tell how much product's going out of the line, we can measure OEE. And we can measure OEE because we'll know how much product has gone in, so we'll know when the line's running. We'll know how much product's gone out. That'll give us scrap and or yield, right? We can also measure when the line's down. So if there's no product passing the second sensor, we know the line's down. And so they also knew the performance by that, based on how quickly the line's running and things like that, the cycle time at which the line's performing that. So by a simple 2-sensor and focusing on, they rolled this out in the entire facility. We're only talking about a couple of $100 to install this type of digitization on a line. You can see here they actually increased their productivity by 50%. And this is in 1 year. And they reduced their downtime per part. So that's a normalized downtime. That would be the chart on the right, by 75%. And they did this really quickly. So they implemented a digitization platform, and then they implemented a 2-sensor integration process, and it took them about 6 weeks. And they were actually able to save $950,000 in labor and $1.3 million in scrap in doing this as well. Huge benefit, huge gains. Was there a question, Chris?
No, I was saying, wow, it's amazing the speed with which this can be implemented and the simplicity, getting back to your overall theme here. And then the oftentimes ROI is hard to prove with these efforts. And Boy, that's a quick and very clear return.
It really is, and it's about getting laser focused, right? It's easy to overcomplicate digitization because there's so many shiny pennies everywhere, and the possibilities are endless. But getting laser focused around a specific metric like OEE or labor minutes per unit or whatever metric you're going to rally behind and really drive home can really make a huge difference in an organization.
Yeah, awesome.
So, even that example that I gave you is really focused around machines, right? And this is also one of the pitfalls that we find that people can really kind of get stuck in and can be overwhelming for them. So if you look at the chart on the left here, most companies are laser focused in that traditional digitization on machines, integrating machines, machine tag data. Anytime the machine errors out, we want to know every little detail about, high limits, low limits, faults, everything under the sun. And they spend all of their energy digitizing that. The watch for is that you'll spend many months, if not years, building in this complex digitization integration, and then you'll get over to the chart on the right-hand side, which shows you the opportunity for digitization. And I'll draw your attention to the pie slice on the upper right-hand corner, the blue one that says code red. This is basically accounting for the machine impact of downtime as it relates to digitization. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people think by digitizing their manufacturing machines that they're going to solve all of their digitization problems. And what we've found is that that's only a fraction, typically between 25 and 35% of their overall impact to the production process is actual machine downtime. What we find is oftentimes, as you can see by this, 60 to 75% are other ancillary type processes that have an impact to the production process that also need digitization process to ensure we're responding and managing those effectively. Things such as material, which is the next big one, defects, material deviation or product deviation, all of those types of processes that are outside of the machine realm are huge hotbeds for digitization. And when we go into companies, what we typically find is they've all adopted, or many of them have adopted, some lean principles. And with lean principles, people oftentimes, have adopted like a Toyota production system. And, the company puts their name in front of the words production system, and they've created this magical production system, right? Whether that would be an L2L production system or a Toyota production system. Really, that's just the way they operate, right? And those are the fundamentals of their operating process. And there's tremendous opportunity to digitize those processes out on the shop floor. So when you think about digitization, just like a smartphone, think about it as more than just a cell phone, right? If we had stopped it, phone calling and text messaging, it's amazing, how much has really grown out of just thinking outside the box and thinking about what processes we can digitize with a smartphone to really optimize that experience in the way we operate. So let's talk a little bit about creating a strategy around not letting best get in the way of better. Okay, and there's a great quote here from Patton around a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. And I wish next week was an accurate measure of time with regards to digitization projects, but typically a lot of companies fall into this trying to put together a perfect plan and end up spending months or sometimes even years trying to develop that perfect plan. And by doing that, oftentimes the competition comes up and then can surpass them on somebody that's got a more focused approach to digitization. So when we look at a minimalist plan, let's call that the good plan, it's really focused on the process, as we touched on in the last one. It's gathering enough data to drive action. And once we drive action, If we need more data, then let's capture more data. Let's do more integration, more digitization to solve more problems. It's really focused on engaging all of the experts, the people that understand the process the best, and providing data to the people in the activities to really help them to solve problems. It's results-focused digitization. So it's digitizing for results. And as we touched on earlier, it's an evolutionary approach. When we look at the contrasting perfect plan, oftentimes it's a project focus with a defined, we're going to make a decision and we're going to go, and there's going to be an end, and we're going to be digitized at the end of it. You know, if you think about a cell phone, if we had used that approach, where we would be today versus where we are in reality today. When you think about digitization, it's really a journey, and it's going to continue to evolve, and then the technology is going to continue to advance. It's not a project. Or that they're looking at it from the perspective that we need to capture all of the data, everything, and we don't want the operator to touch anything. Companies that are successful will bring people along with the change, right? And the change and the feedback from the people will drive where the digitization focus really lies. Or, as I mentioned, they'll feel like they have to have a perfect plan to take the first step, and that's just, you know, it's just not a successful plan. And we touched on pilot purgatory, and a lot of companies fall into this, but it also, when you think about all data and capturing everything under the sun, we call it a data graveyard, where basically all this data goes and nobody uses it and nobody's driving any action from it, and it just goes there to die. And it's not about creating a data graveyard, it's about driving results and driving action. So that's really, you know, not letting best get in the way of better with regards to your digitization initiatives. So the next section is really, okay, we've asked some key questions. We've looked at what are the key elements of the strategy. Now, how do we roll this out? You know, how do we design a long-term plan? And then, you know, what are the elements of that? And the key elements for us and what's been successful is, you know, how do we mature, how do we scale, and how do we support, you know, digital transformation out on the shop floor? The first element is around maturing digitization. So what are some opportunities that we have around maturing? Starting with the basics. Everybody's at a different place, but if you're really kind of taking that first step, there's oftentimes things that are easier than others when you're looking at digitizing your process. So looking at, you know, things like building process and digitization around, let's say, materials. You know, imagine if, you know, a facility today that doesn't have any digitization, a production line runs out of material, they have to call a supervisor, the supervisor calls the warehouse, they then send out, let's say, a fork truck driver with the material. Finally, we get material to the line and we start the line again. Imagine if we were to digitize that process and the operator could simply hit one button, and then 2 minutes later, the fork truck driver shows up with the product that they need, right? That's just a very simple example of a process that happens hundreds of times in a manufacturing facility, where you can implement digitization processes to streamline and optimize the operation. So just look at what's happening out on the shop floor and start with some of the basics. That's going to be a lot cheaper approach than trying to upgrade all your PLCs and integrate every machine you have in your plant. That's a really, really big project and really expensive project. There's also opportunities to start with, you know, communication. Certainly the material is an example of communication, but communication to different departments, you know, be it engineering or quality, and digitizing that communication really can be, you know, great areas to focus on. Metrics, we talked about the OEE metric. Many companies are looking to provide, you know, a more real-time data, and digitizing around your production, your scrap, certainly downtime, and the things that we've touched on are great opportunities to digitize, so you get more accurate, actionable, real-time data to move the business forward. Ultimately, there's also opportunities to take, you know, if we talk about that production system, some companies are using like action item boards and they're still writing on Post-it notes. There's a huge opportunity to digitize, action and accountability. So certainly, leverage those types of options. And what we say is do digitize your production system. Look at your production system as a whole and how you can digitize that. Don't build a data graveyard. And this image that we have on the right here is really, when you think about this, the goal is to make incremental steps in digitization, bring the people along with us, and really drive the business forward by using data-driven results. And a lot of companies want to start at a really low-level digitization and kind of leapfrog all the way to the top. And they're the companies that are typically overwhelmed. They're the companies that typically struggle with a perfect plan, and they don't really know where to start, and they end up kind of burning out and kind of crashing into the side of that mountain. So really be careful of that approach, and really focus on starting with the basics. Scaling for success. So when we talk about scaling, one of the things that we need to look at is what's it going to take to implement a digitization transformation. Certainly when we talk about Minimalist, a lot of companies are running on skeleton crews. They've really leaned out, the management as well as the support staffing, and they're trying to figure out how do we make a transformation, with limited resources. We're already, kind of behind the ball when it comes to staffing. First of all, get a baseline or an inventory of what you have for internal resources. A lot of times we'll talk to folks at corporate that say, hey, we don't have anybody that knows how to do any of this stuff. And then we'll talk to somebody at the plant who is actually already collecting some digital data and already aggregating it, maybe doing some basic data analysis. So get an inventory of what you have. Sometimes your internal IT groups, some of your controls engineers, some of your electricians even have a lot of experience with opportunity, with ways of digitizing the operation. There's certainly lots of partners out there. If you don't know, what it's going to take, there's partners that can help with integration, digitization. The watch for is focus. I would say start small and think big. Be careful not to kind of jump in too quickly. And then the biggest one is leveraging proven technology. Those are the companies that are able to make the fastest improvements in their environments by leveraging proven technology. Digitalization platforms such as L2L, integration connectors where they have other systems that they can leverage more and more by digitizing and collaborating with other data sets. And platforms like what we do allows you to take that digital information and bring it together into a more cohesive package that you can then take action on, which is the most important part of having data, is driving that action. APIs. APIs is another tool that people will use basically to pass information back and forth and optimize their data sets and digitization for improvement. So, by focusing on these elements and what it's going to take from a resource perspective as well as, software and or hardware, utilizing some of these tools will allow you to scale much faster, quicker implementation. We're not talking about years, we're talking about weeks and or a few months. Certainly quicker ROI, focusing on appropriate integration. Just because you have data in another system doesn't mean it should be integrated. And by asking, what really is necessary will help us to identify, is anybody doing anything with that data? Do we need to do anything with that data? And focusing on where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck on things like integration in your facilities. And then driving more actionable data, ultimately, for scaling for success. So a lot of people are curious about, hey, we want to make sure that this is something management can support. We want to make sure it's going to proliferate throughout the whole organization. And when you look at what management really wants from a top-down focus, management's about driving results. They're not about creating a perfect plan. They really want to see the plants be profitable. They want to see them grow. They want to see increased sales, decrease scrap, and just focus on, optimizing their production facilities. So when you laser focus on implementing solutions for real problems, that's where you win. And then celebrating those wins and sharing best practices, within your organization and within outside of your organization. One of our customers actually won an award this past month for their digitization efforts. And one of the quotes they said was, for the first time, everybody from the shop floor all the way to management is looking at the same data. And I'm always a little shocked when I go into a facility and I see that the management KPI boards are the most digital real-time data. And then you get to the shop floor and it's captured on paper and then it gets filed and somebody has to, pick it all up and then enter it into an Excel file. And so really, celebrate those wins and then focus on how do we digitize at all levels of the organization. And by digitizing at all levels of the organization, it ensures linkage, and it also promotes cross-functional alignment. Everybody is basically playing from the same sheet of music at that point. It really helps to make sure everybody can see whether or not we're winning or we're losing, and we're all using the same data to drive forward. So in summary, it's no better time than right now to take the first step. If you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling like, hey, this is a way bigger project than what I want to encounter, this is going to take a long time, it's going to take a lot of money, it doesn't have to. There's solutions out there that can allow you to take huge steps, million-dollar steps, by digitizing what matters, taking action, and building a plan around what works, and learning from the mistakes that you make, and making small mistakes, and continuing to just climb to the top of that digitization journey. All right.
Very cool stuff. Laser focus. I love that.
Awesome. No, I'm really passionate about it, and so I'm excited that I had the opportunity to share our approach in a little bit different angle on this today. So wanted to open it up if there are any questions that we've had from any of the participants.
Yeah, there are some questions in the hopper. I will invite the attendees now to submit your questions using that question button on your screen, and we'll get answers for you right now. Again, if you're joining us on demand, you can still submit your questions, and we'll get answers for you via email from Mark. I invite you to check out the handouts there from L2L in that handout section as well. I love you talking about, and this is something that I hear repeatedly over and over again, is for these digitalization efforts to succeed, they really need to be adopted across the enterprise, from not only the people actually implementing this stuff or working with some of these tools and techniques on the plant floor, but also the mid-level managers and the C-suite, and then even in the marketing department and the HR and everybody, because it really does affect everybody, and the more widely it's adopted, the more widely it's going to be successful. And on the front end of that, if you simplify the process, more people are going to buy in and going to engage with it.
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris, and that's where we see companies really taking off. Is where they're not leaving people behind, or they're not trying to work around people or process. They're really adopting it and embracing it, and it's driving the entire business forward. From the top all the way to the shop floor. Yeah.
All right, last push. Send in your questions with that question button. We'll get answers for you from Mark. Now we're going to jump into the Q&A section, and when we wrap up, we'll go back to your contact information there, Mark. First question: when taking the minimalist approach, how do you ensure that you aren't implementing dead-end point solutions? If you only focus on automatically capturing production KPIs, you may implement a solution that is difficult to integrate with a higher level business analysis system or peer solutions for quality training or maintenance. So how do you ensure that you're not going down unsuccessful roads here, Mark?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a watch for. You have to be careful that when you're implementing solutions, it's not a point solution that's only going to solve one problem. So when you are evolving on a digitization journey, it's important to select a platform that has the enough reach to grow with you, and that it also has the capability to really communicate with other systems, so you don't end up with kind of another siloed system. So when you are doing your due diligence, certainly you want to look out for systems that can't grow as you grow in your digitalization journey. They might solve your problem today, but then as the water level lowers, you need to now solve different problems or bring in more granular data. You want to make sure that that digitization platform can scale with you. So that's definitely a watch for in terms of point solutions. The second part to answer, the second part I would answer there is also making sure that that platform has the ability to integrate either through integration connectors and or APIs to and from that systems and your other systems. So that way you're not, you're not creating boundaries around your digitization where you now have fences that you can't get the data where you need to and then take action from it.
Yeah, there's no point in limiting yourself. Yeah, we're just right now talking about systems on the larger end, and we talked about simple, cheap, fast sensors on the small end. Next question comes in here asking about the tools available to assist in this process. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly there's tons of hardware. We personally aren't a hardware company, but when we look at rolling out digitization, and some of the simplest things that people have the most gain from are giving them like tablets so that they can then interface a digitization solution.
Sure.
It's also about simple sensors. The example I gave about the 2 sensor system, those were actually hardwired, but now you can get wireless sensors for I think around $100 and start capturing data and start integrating that with digitization systems. So there's a ton of hardware out there. We're not a hardware provider, but the technology continues to get, better, cheaper, and quicker to implement. But certainly the biggest gains we've seen is sometimes you just give somebody a $200 tablet and now they're digitized. And you can create workflow processes around lots of different things that they interface on a day-to-day basis, out on the shop floor.
That leads to the next question here, talking about, how simple it can be to equip the modern worker. In your experience, how has the workforce responded to this digitization movement? Do you find that people embrace these approaches? Do you find that people are wary of these things and they don't want to learn new skills? Is it a combination of the both? What's the response? And then what's give me a tip to overcome some of that reticence?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Companies are typically, that's definitely a concern for them. They're not sure, if our people are ready for this. I'll hear them say that to me. And what I find, I think, as I mentioned earlier, is that oftentimes they're actually engaged in more digitization outside of the workplace than they are on the inside of the workplace.
You mentioned that.
And so they're using eBay and Amazon and Facebook and all of these apps that they received no training on and have picked up and ran with and evolved with over time. There can be some pushback, certainly from people that are not as tech savvy. Now, the great thing about digitizing that, though, is there's also huge benefits for people when they can see how it can improve their communication, the transfer of information between them and their fellow colleagues. Sometimes you have people that are on opposite shifts that physically never see each other, and digitizing allows them to communicate, where they maybe used to use logbooks or they maybe used to have to send emails and wait, and now digitizing those types of communication methods can really bring people closer together. So, certainly there are people that push back more than others on digitization. As companies are trying to hire skilled trades and retain top talent, people, certainly the younger generations, are looking for this type of technology and actually expecting it. When they come into the workforce, they expect to have, apps and solutions that are easy to use, that show them whether or not they're being successful. They're not interested in filling out paperwork. And so it's really becoming, a barrier of entry to get top talent, in manufacturing.
Yeah, we hear that all the time. Next question here talks about, we're talking about simplifying all these processes, but oftentimes there are legacy systems and assets that might complicate that. What's the best way to evolve from several older legacy systems to start our digital transformation initiative simply?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of companies are running into that. They have a lot of unique single-point solution, disparate systems. Sometimes they're not supported. We don't recommend just ripping and replacing all your old systems out. We do recommend, baselining, what is that system providing? Can that system be integrated with another system? Since we already have that data there, and then leveraging the data in the place that it is today first. And then you may find over time that there's opportunities to phase out other systems, or you may find, hey, that system is effective, and by using a simple API, we're able to actually leverage that data even more, and we'll keep that system. But the great thing is that with APIs and integration and digitization platforms, you don't have to, wholesale get rid of, old systems. You can use a more methodical approach. Anybody that's ripped a system out and put a new system in knows how much confusion and chaos that can cause in terms of disruption. And that's a lot of times the reason why people don't embark on these types of things, is because they know how much work and how big of a challenge that can be. So.
Another solicitation for questions from the audience. We have a couple in the hopper, and we're running out of time a little bit, but we have time for a few more. If you want to send them in real quickly, we can get those addressed. We talked about it a minute ago here. Here's a question. I'm hearing more about digital platforms. Can you dive into that a little bit more? Explain what a digital platform is in this capacity, and what are the challenges that they overcome?
Yeah, so really, a digital platform is basically a way to digitize your operation and maximize performance. So companies that, obviously have production facilities, have all of these information streams and all of these workflows out in the production process. And there are things from, overhead pages to walkie-talkies to paper to, to actual CMMSs or MESs and things like that. A digital platform basically allows you to bring all of that data into a single pane of glass so that you can then take action on that more simplistically. And it actually makes it a lot easier for people to adopt, because they're not then having to access, let's say, 10 or 12 different systems. They can go to one system and get everything they need in one place and really simplify the user experience. That also helps with the adoption. When you ask people to use 12 different systems and you have, let's say you have turnover and you're training new people and things like that, being able to have one platform that people can go to and you can just bring the data into them seamlessly makes it so much easier to adopt and then execute.
Yeah, for sure. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Here's another question about time frame. You used that one example of a real quick turnaround, but I think you said it was about 6 weeks. What's the quickest turnaround time you've seen from implementation of a simple digitalization program like this to getting actionable insights that are enacting positive changes? Is that about as quick as you've seen, about 6 weeks, or?
Yeah, so we average, and this is something we measure, it's one of our KPIs, we average 50 days, basically from when we take the first step to when we have actionable dispatch, what we call dispatch data, out on the shop floor that's capturing those digitized events, and then you can take action. So 50 days to when you actually are starting to capture those. And then it's amazing, usually within a couple of weeks of having that data, it's pretty clear where their opportunities are, where they have material issues and where they have certainly downtime and other types of issues. So usually it's pretty quick that you can start having actionable data. It's not uncommon for the ROI to be 3 to 6 months in terms of payback. So it's not a long-term implementation, and it's also not a long-term payback. By having off-the-shelf type solutions and leveraging proven technology, it's a lot cheaper than trying to start from scratch and try to build a huge project.
Yeah. Last question. I want to pose one of mine to you here. I want you to forecast a little bit, and I always like to kind of look at a big picture. What excites you about this simplifying the process of digitalization and the minimalist approach in the near future, in the coming 6 months or year or 5 years? What most excites you about this mindset tackling the digitalization process?
That's a great question. I think what excites me the most is seeing how people adapt to the change and how quickly people get on board with digital transformation. I think marrying the human behavior and seeing the excitement when people make huge improvements and then getting them excited about the technology as it is advancing and seeing that grow together is really, really exciting. And so that's what I would say excites me the most is how, when you bring the people together with technology solutions and you can ultimately move a business forward where people maybe otherwise thought wasn't possible is really what excites me about digital transformation going forward. Certainly, there's a lot of exciting things around now that you have digital information and you evolve. There's certainly, that's where you can get into the AI and some of the preventive, predictive type solutions. So, I'm always excited to see people thinking bigger picture, but then having a realistic plan on how they're going to get to that point, and helping to evolve them on that journey so they can really mature as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and an enthusiastic adoption of these practices is validation that they're smart and they work, and that buy-in is going to help everything work better. Mark,
absolutely.
I'll put up your contact information again here today. Mark invites anyone to shoot him a note via email there, or to check out the L2L website. I'll leave that up for one more second.
Yeah, Chris, just touching on that. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, certainly check us out on L2L.com. Actually, our founder, Bob Argyle, and COO is going to be doing a fireside chat in a couple weeks. So we'll probably send you guys that participated a link, and we'd love to have you check into that as well.
Awesome. We'll be there. Again, here's a push for this is the final installment of our Spring Insight webinar series. You can find the full library of webinars on demand. You can click that link there and check those out. We want to thank the attendees for joining us here today and throughout this webinar series. It's been a ton of fun, and we've learned a ton of stuff. Mark, we'd like to thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah, we want to thank L2L for being the gold sponsor of our Insight webinar series. We'd also like to thank Inductive Automation, the platinum sponsor, Hilscher, Software AG, Uptake, and Sesame. Again, we'd like to thank Mark for sharing his insights. We'd like to thank the attendees for joining us. We want to note that you should keep your eye out for the fall webinar series coming down the road in a few months now. And as always, we encourage everyone to go out and make it a smart day.